Much, Jules. If Thea could load the first slide, please. And next slide, thank you. Yes, so I'm going to follow on from Jules with starting with the sort of gloomy end of things, I suppose, with the recent State of Nature report, which is the fourth report in 10 years, and which unfortunately continues the theme of biodiversity crisis deepening, with over half our plant species having declined in both their distribution and abundance over the last 50 years, and a quarter of those plant species being threatened. It's a situation even worse for birds, with 43% of our birds in a threatened status. And the interesting thing on that is that overall, we've got 1 in 6 species in Britain and 1 in 7 in England in threatened status. And if you want to know what threatened status means, it's an internationally recognized series of criteria, and you can see them on the right-hand side of the screen there: vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And those threatened statuses are, as I say, recognized across the board. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those as I feature some species that we've been monitoring. But of course, there is also hope in this report. And that's what Essex Wildlife Trust is all about bringing hope and reversing those declines. Next slide, please. And we do this through a number of ways, but one of the key things, of course, is to have a monitoring programme, which I spoke about at the last AGM. And what is really delighted to say, having only set up the conservation evidence team in the last year, and the monitoring programme itself only been going for just over 2 years, we've now got 74% coverage of the trust reserves, with at least one of our 12 modules having been carried out across the reserves. And what you can see on the map there is the coverage, which, as you can see, goes right across the whole of Essex, across all our reserves. So 74% coverage, but also a very broad county-wide coverage. And you can see from the little discs on each reserve that there are a multitude of modules being surveyed. And I'm going to have a look at a few of those in a moment. So the impact is high of our monitoring programme. That's essential to know what's going on. Next slide, please. One of the key ones are birds, because they're sort of top of the food chain for many things. They're well and easily studied, and they produce reliable data over many, many years. We've been doing annual bird breeding surveys now for 3 years, and we've been doing it across 51 of our 93 reserves. So over half of our reserves have bird data. As you remember from the first slide, 43% of birds in Britain are in threatened status. That is, there's a high likelihood of extinction in the country if we're not careful. But what you can see, that is so-called red list status, that high threatened status, you can see from the diagram there, which don't look at the detail, but that 46 of our 51 reserves have a red listed birds breeding on them. And all of our 51 reserves that we're studying have amber listed, a status just below the red list status. So you can see the importance of the reserves as refuges. I'm just going to look at one of those bird species, the turtle dove, which is a critically endangered species. Next slide, please. Now, turtle doves are declining very, very rapidly. And in the last 50 years, in my lifetime, they've declined by 93%. But Essex remains a stronghold, particularly along the coast. And the most important sites in Essex are the Essex Wildlife Trust reserves. And you can see 4 of them illustrated on this map. And you can see the years 2021 to 2023, the 3 years that we've been doing the annual bird breeding census, illustrated there in different colours, with orange for this year. And as you can see, it's a mixed picture, with Abbots Hall in the middle there actually having no birds this year for the first time in living memory. So it's a real shocker, if you like. However, what you'll see that Rabness, which is the best site in the county, is stable at the moment, and that Fingringhoe, the species, has bounced back. So it's a very important illustration of how important monitoring itself is to get that trend, also showing that the bird is adaptable. It's moved into Sargent's Orchards, for example, a new site there on the right. And we're working very closely with the RSPB specialist team across the county, not just in our own reserves, but of course with private landowners across the wider landscape. Next slide, please. And it's about that ability to intervene and to manage land, which is very important, based on conservation evidence. And here you see a project at the Blue House Farm, funded by BIFA to the tune of $250,000. Very important project, spend a lot of money on it, but it's based on robust scientific evidence. And what you'll see is the impact that that's had straight away in a matter of a year. you've got there illustrated the 2022 figures and the 2023 figures in orange for the lapwing and the redshank, birds that are in real decline and under real threat. And that impact, you can see there that lapwing numbers are up by 60%, redshank numbers are up by 35%. And you might say, well, yeah, well, 2023 was just a very good year, wasn't it? How do you know it was the impact of the project? Next slide, please. And what this shows for the redshank, just one of those two species, is that there was a really significant impact with the work that we did, re-wetting 40 hectares of the grassland and putting a predator exclusion fence around those re-wetted areas. You can see from the left-hand side there, where I've outlined it in red, that the birds have increased massively on round marsh, where there is predator exclusion fencing and re-wetting. Now you could see they've moved from over the railway, which is on the left-hand side, where they've just moved. But we know that they have increased by 35%, and you can see that in the second red blob there, which I've circled, which shows the flat fields, 4 of them, which we've re-wetted and put fencing around. The numbers have increased from nothing to the numbers there, nearly nine pairs. Next slide, please. And talking of impact and talking of monitoring, I think the insects illustrate it very well. We know we've got not just a biodiversity crisis, but some people have called it the insect apocalypse, which is dramatic. Here you can see that on Abbots Hall Reserve, just a single reserve, we're bucking the national trend. If you look at the top of the slide next to the photograph of the lovely gatekeeper butterfly, which is a common species of scrub and grassland, that the UK trend is for a 42% decline in numbers in the 44 years since 1976. And the 10-year average decline is 11%. And what you see here on the diagram is a 10-year study that we've done. It's longer than the general program. We've been doing the butterfly monitoring for more than a decade now. You can see for our 10-year average, rather than a decline of 11%, we've doubled the numbers. Next slide, please. And what you can then see, I think, for a similar species, another grassland species, but even a more specialist grassland species, the lovely small heath, which in my lifetime, I got used to it being a common species of dry grassland. You can see here that those top figures show that the UK trend is half the species, at 49%, half the numbers have gone in 44 years, with again a 10-year average decline of 13%. And that's meant that, as you can see on the left-hand side, the small heath in red there is NT, is near threatened. It's got a common butterfly has actually become near threatened. It looks gloomy, but it shows when you look at the data from our reserve, 5 reserves shown there on that graph, that although the numbers go up and down a bit, the overall increase in blue with the red line running through it is an overall increase since 2011. Over the last decade, they've increased on our 5 reserves where we're monitoring them. However, what you can also see is a mixed picture compared to the gatekeeper, in that last year with that very, very dry summer, what Jules has referred to, it's even hotter and drier. If you remember last summer, very dry, parched grassland. This grassland butterfly didn't do well in its second generation, which it needs at the end of the year, at this time of year, September time, October time, and it fell in numbers. The good news is that we know that the numbers have bounced back this year in 2023, but I just can't yet show them on this slide. What it shows, I think these insects are the importance of our reserves and the importance of long-term monitoring. Next slide, please. The final one on insects and the penultimate slide, just on pollinators, something that the study showed, that the State of Nature report nationally showed, was that pollinators have decreased by 22%. That's an astonishing amount for a group of insects that are absolutely crucial to our food production. Interestingly, we have a group of insects, a Section 41 species, they're so-called, called, they're protected as conservation priority species under the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, and they're bumblebees. Essex is really important for bumblebees, and it illustrates here the brown-banded carder. What's great is that this has actually expanded its range. It's moved northwards in Essex, possibly in response to climate change, and now breeds at Abbots Hall, having only previously resided in the Thames side. That's really great news. To modify that, though, we know that the shrill carder bee, a close cousin, did also expand, but seems to be retracting, and we need to understand why. The importance of research, which we hopefully will be carrying out with the Environment Agency and with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, is illustrated here. We do need to understand why those numbers are not always going in the same direction for different species. Next slide and final slide. I just want to end with a really nice piece of news about wildflowers. Green-winged orchids using the red list criteria are vulnerable to extinction in England. That's again pretty astonishing. And I remember when I started in conservation, we had green-winged orchid meadows on Mersey Island. They were destroyed shortly after I started conservation through a loophole in the Wildlife and Countryside Act at the time. But what's extraordinary, as you can see from the figures there on the slide, is that Essex Wildlife Trust has 4 reserves with really high numbers of this wonderful, beautiful species on it, this vulnerable species. And what's more striking is that Oxley Meadow has nearly 50,000. What we know is that that number is actually slightly declining, so we've got to be careful to monitor that, and the importance of monitoring emphasised again. But what we also know from speaking with Kew Gardens research team is that Oxley Meadows is possibly the most important site, or the best suited site in terms of its soil and its mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that associate with the roots of orchids, in the whole of England. So interestingly, Oxley Meadow isn't statutorily protected. It has no SSSI protection. It's not even a local nature reserve. The only reason it's there is because of Essex Wildlife Trust. We've protected the site. We've also managed it. This flower needs constant management. It needs hay mowing and it needs grazing. So only because of our protection do we have that 50,000 display of orchids. And the monitoring, of course, is vital because we need to know whether that number is going up or down. But we're hoping to continue that research with Kew Gardens, and I hope to finish on that rather lovely note that we do support an amazing population of this wonderful plant, despite the fact it's vulnerable across England. Thank you for listening.